Areva, is it okay if
The
Michael and I
Supreme Court
chat?
today seemed torn about both the merits and the legality of a proposed Purdue Pharma bankruptcy plan that would allocate billions of dollars to help ease the nation's opioid crisis, but also shield the family that owns the company from future lawsuits. Justices across the ideological spectrum asked tough questions of lawyers from the Justice Department, which opposes the deal, and attorneys for Purdue and the vast number of parties that have an interest in the outcome. Israeli troops and Hamas fighters are locked in some of their fiercest fighting of the 2-month-old war, including at close quarters as Israel looks to decisively finish its operations in and around Gaza City while launching its offensive in the south. Israeli commanders have said they are working against a political clock to complete their objectives of removing Hamas from power and freeing more than 100 hostages, worrying that U.S. support will dry up if the war drags on and the civilian casualties continue to mount. More than 15,000 Palestinians have died during Israel's offensive, and authorities in the Hamas-run enclave said mostly these individuals have been women and children, a figure that doesn't distinguish between militants and civilians. Palestinian militants still hold hostages from the October 7th Hamas attacks in Israel that Israeli officers say killed more than 1,200 people. The White House delivered a dire warning to congressional leaders today that time is running out for lawmakers to approve more assistance to Ukraine, sounding the alarm that the battlefield gains of Ukraine against Russia are at risk without more money. It's the latest warning from top officials as the administration presses to get President Joe Biden's $61.4 billion emergency funding requests for Ukraine across the finish line. The proposal is part of a $106 billion supplemental package Biden sent to lawmakers in October for additional funding for Ukraine, Israel, the Pacific, and the U.S.-Mexico border. Harvard will be under scrutiny in Congress tomorrow when President Claudine Gay testifies at a House committee hearing about anti-Semitism on campus. She'll be joined by her counterparts from Penn and MIT. At Harvard, the tumult has engulfed President Gay, the university's first Black president, who took the reins July 1st. She was already contending with the Supreme Court's ruling against Harvard's use of race in admissions, which was handed down 2 days before she started as president. President Gay has drawn criticism for not initially denouncing more than 30 student groups that placed blame for the October attacks entirely on Israel and didn't condemn Hamas, which the U.S. and European Union designate a terrorist group. And Governor Doug Burgum of North Dakota, the wealthy former software executive who entered the presidential campaign in June, hoping a back-to-basics appeal on the economy would propel him forward. Well, he dropped out of the race today for the Republican nomination. Though his personal fortune could have kept his campaign afloat, Governor Burgum's mild demeanor and resolute focus on 3 issues, the economy, energy, and foreign policy, never caught on with a GOP base steeped in the pugilistic flash of Donald Trump and the more visceral appeal of social issues. This is Areva Martin in Real Time, and I'm your host, Areva Martin. This is your one-stop destination for today's trending news, expert analysis, and my unfiltered opinions. This is hour 2 of Areva Martin in Real Time, and this is the hour where we go deep, where we dig behind the headlines, and we bring you those stories that people are talking about. And right now, since it is the first week in December, most people are thinking about and talking about the upcoming holidays. Whether you are going to celebrate Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, or Christmas, whatever you are going to celebrate, you are likely to come into contact with family members from different parts of the country, maybe some that you haven't seen in months or years. You may find yourself at holiday parties at your workplace, and you may find yourself starting or ending an intimate relationship. But no matter what the relationship is, we know that good relationships are critical for our health and our happiness, but it's not always easy. to navigate the complexities of relationships, and particularly during this time of year when most folks are a little stressed out, whether it's trying to buy expensive gifts, going into debt to buy those gifts, just the added responsibilities of the holidays. No matter what it is, something about the month of December causes people's nerves sometimes to become frayed, and that can complicate our relationships even more. So I thought today we'd get a jump on those complex relationships that folks may have to and most likely will be navigating this holiday season by bringing on two psychologists, one a practicing psychologist and one a research psychologist. Both have done a lot of work in their professions on the issue of happiness and navigating complex relationships. So when we come forward, it's Brown University meets Columbia University. We're going to talk to both professors from these prestigious universities about what we need to know in terms of navigating relationships during the holiday season. Stay with us, KBLA Talk 1580.
1580.
We are back, and in this hour, we're talking about navigating complex relationships. And if you have a relationship with just about anyone, it's probably a complex relationship. In this hour, Dr. Yael Schonbrun is joining us. She's a clinical psychologist and assistant professor at Brown University. She's also a relationship coach and author of the book Work, Parent, Thrive. Also, Michael Spellian is here, Professor Michael Spellian. He's a professor at Columbia University and the author of a book called The Secret Life of Secrets. Thank you so much, both professors, for joining me to talk about these issues. I read an article, and I think one or both of you were quoted just talking about how difficult it is sometimes to navigate complex personal relationships. Obviously, we've been watching this Hamas-Israel crisis play out in the media, so we know what conflict on a macro looks like, particularly when you're talking between two, groups of countries or two groups of people who seem to have intractable differences. But in this hour, I really want to talk about those personal relationships that seem to be stressed in a particular way during the month of December because of the holidays. So I will start with you, Dr. Schonbrun. Tell us why this month in particular just causes people to probably have more conflicts in their relationships, whether it's work relationships or personal relationships.
Yeah, well, I think there are heightened expectations for the holidays to be a happy time. And because relationships naturally go through ups and downs, those downs feel worse because the difference between the expectations and the reality can grow bigger because those expectations grow more intense. And then there's the fact that we tend to have more contact with family members or other people that we're in relationships with that we may at other times of the year not have as much contact with because there's not as much reason to come into contact. So some of those more complicated extended family relationships or ex-partners, with whom, for example, we share custody of children that we might come into more contact with. And then there's just the general heightened pressure of the holidays, and that kind of pressure can leak into relationships and make us more grumpy in general. And often the people that we take our grumpiness out on are the people that we are in close relationships with.
And I guess there, Professor Slepian, some real science, behind this whole notion of relationships and our health and our happiness. I don't know if we think about it in that way, but tell us what some of the science is.
Well, when it comes to just sort of daily life, it's, feeling good, feeling that there's meaning in sort of what we're doing in the day to day. And when it comes to our relationships, what we see in the research, one of the strongest predictors of a healthy relationship is mutual disclosure, sharing things with each other, communicating things with each other.
So, okay, I'm glad you brought that up because sometimes I think we think in relationships, there's some things better left unsaid. What about that kind of rule that most of us are taught as kids? Like, sometimes the less is more, and we shouldn't be open books, or we shouldn't share certain things. One, because maybe we believe the other person can't take it. It might be painful for the other person to hear. What does the research tell you about that?
Well, the reason we normally disclose is that's how we connect with other people. That's how we tell them what's going on with our, daily life. That's how we learn about other people. It's the stuff of close relationships. Why would we not participate in that? Well, we feel like we're protecting something. When people choose to keep a secret, they think they're protecting maybe themselves or their reputation in the eyes of others, or they think they're protecting someone else or a relationship with someone else. And that's when things can get really complicated really quickly, where if you feel like I'm keeping this secret for the good of the relationship, the question becomes, are you sure? Is that the right decision? How do you know?
Well, okay, that is a good point. Is there some way, Dr. Schombrun, that how would we know what we should disclose to whom, in relationships? Because I am concerned about, that person who overshares. We hear, oftentimes that person who, is just too much information. And then there are, people who seem pretty closed. What are some of the how do you know what is the right amount to share, and to share with whom?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't think that there's an exact recipe for it, an exact science, but Michael Slepian's work, which is terrific, kind of sheds some light. And I think the general idea is that more disclosure helps us to be close, but you don't want to go too quickly, because as you're pointing out, that can feel like too much for somebody that you're first entering into a relationship with. And so one of the things that folks can try is to kind of, dip a toe into disclosure as you're starting to get to know somebody and see how it goes and how it feels, and whether or not there's kind of a reciprocity in the sharing, which is some kind of indication that the disclosure is acceptable and then can be returned, and that can help to foster a closer relationship. So Michael can probably speak about this research in greater depth than I can, but it's fascinating work.
Yeah, because one of the things I'm thinking about, Professor Slepian, and I'd love to hear more about the research, is, if you're getting ready to see family members that maybe you haven't seen for a long time during this holidays, and say there's been some issue that you've had with each other or this person for a while, and you've never really kind of cleared the air, how do you go about, if it is the right thing to do, sitting that person down saying, hey, maybe it happened with your sister when you were 12 years old, or maybe you had a fight about a boyfriend when you were 20 years old, but you never really worked through it. Is this kind of the time, now that everybody's in their 40s, 50s, to sit down and share how you feel about that? Or should that just be left in the past?
I think what's useful about that question is we're sort of sidestepping the really complicated issue for now of what happens when the secret itself could really damage the relationship. If we're not talking about this will instantly be a huge shock to the relationship, I think the question people struggle with, where they realize, well, maybe we do need to have a conversation about this thing, or maybe there's a part of me that I've not shown these people and I want to, or I want to get close with someone in a way I haven't before. When it comes to these more difficult conversations we've been postponing, we're doing research now on this idea of delaying our confessions. We're kind of waiting for that right moment. We do want to talk about it. We do think something good is going to come from it. We know it's going to be difficult, but when is the right time? And I think what's really hard about that question, I think it's the way people usually think about it, is there's no perfect time. You kind of have to create that time.
So, but you said we were sidestepping the big question, or the harder question, and the harder question being when the secret itself is going to be shocking, like I had an affair, like I stole money from you, like I lied to you. Is that the kind of secret that, you're talking about typically?
Yeah, I think everything except for infidelity, which maybe we can talk about specifically, most things people can imagine a world where we can get past this and it'll be difficult, but we can work through it together and we'll start off somewhere better than where we started, or, end somewhere better than where we started. But when it comes to something about infidelity, what's really tricky about that one is, for some people, that's a deal breaker. That's the end of the relationship. And what do you do in that situation?
Okay. And I know, Dr. Schomburn, you do relationship counseling. I have a she's deceased, very, very good friend who was also a marriage and family therapist. And we used to often talk about that. Is that something that all couples in therapy should disclose? What's your take on that big secret, that secret that some people like Dr. Slepian said, deal breaker type secret?
Yeah, well, it is a very complicated question. And I think the answer is it depends. And that's a bit of what Michael's research shows as well, which is that at times it is not appropriate to share the secret. So, for example, if you have had an affair and disclosing it to a partner could mean that you'd be in a dangerous situation, that there's like abuse that could be happening, then it's not wise to share it. Some might also argue that if it's happened in the past and it was just one time, that disclosing it would really just be a way for the person who engaged in infidelity to offload their guilt, and that it wouldn't be very productive or helpful for the relationship in the current state. So that might not be wise. But if it's something, and what I think is so fascinating about Michael's research is that it shows that when we carry a secret and it's something that occupies a lot of our mind space and distracts us, that it can really interfere with our relationship in very important ways. It can cause us to, for example, have a hard time talking about things that we're struggling with in the relationship that have nothing to do with infidelity, that would help the relationship to become better. And so in that case, disclosing the infidelity can actually offer a bridge to repairing what's wrong with the relationship. Now, what some people might argue is that if you've cheated on your partner, then that automatically should mean that the relationship is over, that the partner who has been betrayed by your cheating should leave you. And in many cases, that can be the case, right? As Michael said, it could be the deal breaker, and very appropriately so. But as a relationship counselor, when couples come to me after an affair has been discovered and they want to figure out a way to resolve what's happened in the past, and often the infidelity is a symptom of a more foundational problem that has been existing in the relationship for some time, then some of the work to recovering from an affair does have to do with having a full disclosure, the partner who engaged in the infidelity making really significant and dedicated amends to the partner that they've cheated on, and the partner who's been cheated on to have the help from the partner who has engaged in infidelity to repair the trust, to rebuild trust that has been shattered. And it's a very long and painful process, but it all begins with a disclosure that is very honest and forthcoming, and with intent to try to show up in a new and more healthy way in the relationship. And none of it is easy. And I don't think that there is one right answer. It really does depend on the nature of the relationship, on the history of the relationship, on the context in which the infidelity occurred, and all the sort of specifics that exist there.
And just kind of staying with the infidelity piece, because obviously that's that kind of secret that is a bombshell for a lot of people. Professor Slepian, what does the research say about how might you know? And obviously there's no guarantee, but presumably I would hope there are some indicators about certain people who, again, might be able to handle that kind of information and others who may not. Is there anything in the research about that? Because I would imagine that there's some couples that, Dr. Schomburn will see who may say, oh, I shouldn't have told them. And we probably could have gone on and been happily, or at least married, I don't know how happily, for, decades to come.
I mean, I think we can predict partners who have trouble discussing difficult issues already. They're definitely going to be at a disadvantage to handle what is a really complicated bombshell. I think when we get back to the reasons for why you would do this, one reason is you just think it's the morally right thing to do. Another reason is you're trying to relieve guilt. If this is a repeat problem, if you cheat on this person multiple times, I don't think you'll find a psychologist who will say that's an okay secret to keep. Where things get really tricky is the one-time indiscretion. And in trying to make that really tough choice about whether you should discuss it with your partner, one of the best things you can do is discuss that question with someone else, because it's so complicated and it's really hard.
Wait a minute. Discuss which question with someone else?
Whether you should confess.
Oh, okay. Someone else other than a therapist that might be working with you?
Oh no, a therapist would be a great person.
Oh,
A
okay.
friend who you want to be careful when choosing friends to confide in. In my own research, we see that people can really appreciate that that was difficult for you to do, and revealing a secret can bring the two people closer together. But I've also seen in our research that people can become burdened by other people's secrets. Now I have to carry the burden with you too. Now I might have to conceal it from your partner as well. And so that makes who you talk to pretty difficult, whether you're potentially entangling them into the concealment.
And I would imagine, Dr. Schönbrunn, there's not much, in your line of work, you wouldn't recommend that, say, that third party who has been given information about that big secret, the infidelity secret, they definitely shouldn't be the person revealing that, should they, to the person that was cheated on?
Yeah, it's an interesting question as a therapist, because the ethics get so complicated so quickly. So for example, if I'm seeing a couple, and in general, I see the couple together, but if there's an instance where, for example, this has happened before, where I've consulted with the individual therapist for the couple, one partner in the couple that I'm seeing, and I discover that it turns out that there is an affair, and now I'm carrying the secret, except I'm treating the couple, and either they don't know or only one person knows that I know. It becomes very complicated. And so different couples therapists have different ways of approaching that. For me, I would either encourage the person who's having the affair to disclose, or I would pause couples therapy, because it isn't, I think, ethical for me to carry that secret. And it almost acts as leverage to encourage the disclosure so that we can figure out what to do with that background issue.
What if you're not a therapist, like you're just a friend who you know about it?
I think that is also very complicated, and people have to sort of make these very thorny decisions. But I do think letting the person who has confessed to you know that this feels like a tough burden to carry, and how they can help you carry it, either by revealing it to the person that they've cheated on, or by ceasing the behavior. So I think, but it gets very tricky. The other thing that you had sort of alluded to is that, when those disclosures happen, that there is often a huge fallout mental health wise, that people have such a trauma reaction. It really feels like the rug has been pulled out from under the person who has been betrayed. And so pushing it before people are prepared to participate in the process of handling that kind of a crisis is also a dilemma.
Yeah, I'm thinking, well, you're right. I'm thinking about that big secret, but I also want to talk about, not the infidelity piece, but sharing with someone how you feel about them or how they make you feel. And, is that a good thing to do? Because that can also be trauma inducing for the person that perhaps is shocked to hear that, you've been uncomfortable around them, or they've said things that you find to be either racist or sexist or problematic. That can also create tension in a relationship. So when we come forward, we'll talk about all of these thorny issues that come up in navigating complex relationships. Stay with us, KBLA Talk 1580. Sports for 60. We are back, and we're talking about good relationships and how to navigate your relationships, whether they're work or personal, during the holiday season. Dr. Yael Schönbrunn is here. She is a clinical psychologist and professor at Brown University. Also, Michael Slepian, professor at Columbia University, is also joining us. They both are authors. Professor Slepian's book is The Secret Life of Secrets, and we've been talking a lot about those bombshell secrets like infidelity, but I also want to talk about not necessarily, Professor Slepian, those big bombshell secrets, but just telling someone that perhaps you've had issues with for a long time, how you really feel about them. That can be dangerous as well. What does your research say about that?
It's a great question, because it's important to remember there are bombshell secrets, and then there's these smaller secrets and everything in between. And to understand how our secrets affect us, we want to look at all of them. For the sort of more in between, these sort of difficult conversations that we want to have, but we've been putting off, that very much resembles what it's like to have a secret. where we want to work through it, but we're stopping ourselves from doing so. And a lot of the harm of keeping secrets is wrestling with that conflict just in your own thoughts, having to be alone with these thoughts, and the frustration of stopping yourself from sharing them with the person you want to talk to. And so in deciding when can I have this conversation, or should I have this conversation, I think the thing to be thinking about is, what is that conversation going to look like? The reason why we so often are hurt by our secrets is we're not thinking about them in healthy ways. And healthy perspectives can come from, productive conversations. Will the conversation be productive? How can you set yourself up for it to be that way? That's the major question. If you feel like there's no way you can have this conversation in a productive way later this month, don't do it. Make a plan for how can we do this in a more productive way.
Yeah, I'm thinking Professor Schomburn, who's also an author of a book called Work, Parent, Thrive, that even like mother-daughter, child, parent, sibling to sibling, people tend to get defensive. So if you're going to have a conversation with your sibling or with your parent or a grandparent, and you're going to say, I don't like it when you do X, that may cause that other person to say, well, wait a minute, I don't do X, that's what you do. And, that back and forth starts, and now you've got an argument going and no one is really listening to the other person. So how do you have even that conversation without someone becoming incredibly defensive, shutting down, or, leading to a bigger argument?
Oh, that's such a great question. And it's a very complicated thing to do. So even if you are incredibly skillful, it doesn't mean that you'll be successful, because you only have control over your own actions, and the other person's response is simply not under your control. But there are a few things that you can do to increase the likelihood of success. One of the things is to really try to be as positive as you can, to almost sandwich the feedback that you have inside of positivity. So I really love you, I care about our relationship, but this behavior really bothers me. Or when we get together, the way that we interact, there's a piece of it that I really would like to work on because I care so much about you. That tends to make it a lot easier for people to really intake. It's sort of like, covering the bitter pill with the sugar encasing, right? It makes it easier to take it in. Another thing that people can try is this mantra that I really offer to the couples that I work with, which is make a request instead of a demand or a complaint. So rather than telling somebody what you really hate that they do, to say, I'd really love it if we could do more of X, Y, or Z. That tends to be easier for people to receive as well. And the final thing I'll suggest is to separate behavior from the person. So rather than you're this kind of a person, you're a great person. It's this behavior that really I find disturbing or troubling or troublesome. And that, again, makes it a little bit easier for people to listen without becoming too defensive. So those are some of the communication tips. But again, it's still hard to deliver that feedback, and sometimes quite important if you feel like your boundaries or your own, safety is being tread upon. It's tricky.
Yeah, and Professor Slepian, what does the research say about like your happiness? Are you happier if you, because some people feel like I'm going to just get this off my chest. I'm going to tell you how I feel. I hope you can take it. I hope you don't get too defensive. I'm not trying to hurt you, but I need to tell you this. All in the sense of this is going to make them feel better. And then, some people will say, if you can deal with it, fine. If you can't, maybe it means we're not going to, spend that whole weekend together during the holidays. Maybe it'll be a 3-hour or 2-hour lunch, and that'll be it. But, is there any research that suggests that that's a healthy way to deal with this? Like it'll make you healthier or happier by unloading what you are thinking about that other person?
It can feel really good to unload, but then the question is, what happens next? And what happens next will depend on how the other person responds. And we're trying to, think through these sort of contingencies. But, when it's something that we're struggling with, rather than when we sort of want to confront someone, if it's something that we're struggling with, the great news is that often when you confide in other people, they say something helpful. And that's because they have a fresh perspective they can offer. They can give you emotional support. Really hard to get that on your own. They can help you work through a problem. They can give you advice. Now, if it's you want to confront someone about something, I think you want to work through the same issues. How can you set yourself up where we find a new perspective that we can both work with going forward? What's not helpful is just rehashing the past. That's not very productive. You can't change the past. What's not helpful is blaming the other person, because that is past oriented as well. And so how can we find something workable in the future? And I think if that's the way you're approaching the problem, you're in a better position.
What about Professor Schomburn, the reality as you get older? Like, some people feel like most people don't want to hear anything bad about themselves. They don't want any criticism of themselves. Like, I don't want to hear it. If I invite you to a play that I produced or I wrote, I just want to hear, that was amazing, that was great. If I show up with a new dress on, all I want to hear from you is, oh my God, that dress is gorgeous. And so like people don't, is there some truth to that most of us don't really want to hear other people's honest feedback?
I think that there is some truth to that, but I also think that people often find feedback to be helpful. It's just that it needs to be delivered in a way that feels positive, and that's sort of that feels productive and not harmful. And I think that there's actually an interesting tip that comes from a research called motivational interviewing. It's a treatment approach. And what they found is that when you ask people permission to give feedback, then they can let you know, are they in a position and interested in an emotional position to receive it, and are they interested in receiving it? And if they are, they can let you know. And if they're not, they can let you know. And if they are, you can share it, and you have their investment and their permission to deliver whatever the feedback is that you're interested in delivering. And if they're not, then you have your feedback about, it's time for you to hold that instead of share it.
So give us an example. So again, the person shows up with outfit on, you're going out to an event, you think they're completely inappropriately dressed. Do you say to that person, I have some feedback if you want to hear it about your outfit?
Yeah. I mean, I think you could even start a little bit more vague than that, which is, hey, we're going out. Do you want to share with one another what we think about how we look and how the statement that we're going to make? Or do you want to just go and feel good about what it is that we're wearing and how we look? And that way, again, you sort of get the other person's buy-in before you tread into a position, into saying something that you can't take back, and now you've got to spend the whole night with them.
So the person says, sure, let's trade, let's share that information. And the person says to you, well, I think you look amazing. Everything's perfect. And then your feedback is, like, do you have something else? Or, is there, you style your hair differently. And now they feel like, I was positive with you, but you weren't positive with me.
Yeah, well, again, I would sort of couch it a little bit more carefully. And this comes from years of doing therapy and knowing the research, but it would be, I really love your style. I think I'm just a little bit worried that you're going to stick out for this reason. I don't know how comfortable you'll feel. Do you want to explore other options, or do you feel comfortable? And that way, again, you're not sort of setting them up for a night where they feel rotten about how they look and you feel guilty for having ruined the night. But, you want to sort of look for opportunities to make things better, as opposed to just delivering feedback that's going to be painful.
While I'm sitting here thinking about every communication I have, I'm probably doing something really wrong. Most of us are. We're going to continue this conversation when we come forward, more about how to navigate relationships and be happier during the holidays. Stay with us, KBLA Talk 1580.
Topics and exciting.
We are back, and we are talking about navigating relationships, particularly given this time of year when so many people are extra stressed out because of the holidays and the extra pressure that we put on ourselves. So, Dr. Schomburn, you just gave this very, very, very eloquent way of giving feedback to a friend or to a relative, and aren't likely to talk to our friends or relatives in that way. So help us, both of you, Dr. Schomburn and Dr. Slepian, like what can we do? We've got I don't know, 21 days or so before Christmas. We have Hanukkah, we have Kwanzaa, we have these big holidays coming up. Are there any tips that you can give us? We're obviously not going to learn to communicate as eloquently and artfully as you just did, but what can we do? Those of us who, want to navigate some relationships with family that we may not have seen for a while, and friends during this period. I'll start with you, Professor Slepian. I know in The Secret Life of Secrets, you've done this research on keeping secrets, and we've talked a lot about infidelity in this hour, but those not so bombshell secrets. Would you say during the holidays that those things that otherwise we might want to bring up, maybe we should just avoid those conversations?
It's possible. If it's Christmas Day, maybe it's not the time to talk about some, experience of trauma to bring up from your childhood with a sibling or something like that. I think, the secrets that people do keep, or if we think about the conversations that people do put off, it's the really hard stuff. And the research shows that putting it off doesn't help. And so if you want to work through a problem more effectively, whether it's a problem that you've been struggling with or a problem that you have with someone else, the question is, how can we talk about this in a way that's going to move us forward and not backward? And if we're thinking about, maybe there's some tone setting, maybe there's some previewing. You say, like, I'd like to talk to you about something in the next few days. Don't blindside anyone. That's never very useful. So people are sort of prepared to discuss the topic in general terms. If you've decided that you think there is a world where they could talk about this, if they're just going to be super closed off, maybe now's not the right time. But I do think the question often should be when, not if. When can we have this conversation in a way that's going to be really helpful?
And a lot of people, obviously, Dr. Schönbrunn, will go to therapy, obviously, see a practitioner like yourself, a clinician. Maybe it's couples therapy, maybe it's family therapy, other kinds of groups that come together for therapy. But what about those folks who aren't likely to go to therapy? Maybe one person wants to, the other person doesn't. Maybe therapy isn't an option at all. Maybe economically, they don't have the resources, or they just don't have access to therapy. And they need to discuss something that perhaps was traumatizing in their childhood, or maybe, even as adults. What advice would you have for them?
Well, there's certainly other resources than going to see a therapist in a therapy office. You can listen to podcasts that dive deep into communication skills. You can read books. You can attend lectures. You can write out a letter and have somebody else look at it to help give you some feedback on the tone that you're striking with your words. So there's lots of ways to kind of learn the skills or do a test drive of what it is that you want to say. But in terms of how to think about it, and I think that you, right before the break, you sort of made the point, that's not how we mostly talk. And I think that's true. And that's not a bad thing. I think you probably show up in your relationships as very authentic, and that's wonderful. I think it's really about figuring out what works in a given relationship, given what you want, what kind of relationship you want to be fostering. So you want to think about what kind of relationship you're building with the person, how much it feels important to protect their feelings versus share something, in other words, like what directions that you want to grow together in. And then if there is something that needs to be heard that feels important for you to communicate to the other person, you want to think through what is a way that I could communicate it that would be easiest for them to hear. Because one of the things that's important to recognize is that in any good conversation at any given point, there's one speaker and one listener. But listening is very, very hard, especially when we're in a position of hearing things that we don't like to hear. And so as a speaker who wants to communicate something, you really want to be thoughtful and curious. What is a way that I could say this that would be easiest for somebody to hear? And again, that goes back to some of the tips that I shared earlier of softening it, sharing some positivity, making requests instead of just demands and complaints, separating the behavior from the person's character. And in all of these ways, it makes it much easier for somebody to digest what it is that might feel important for you to share with them. But again, you want to sort of balance the way that the relationship has been, the way that you'd like to grow it, the other person's feelings, and what it is that you'd like to communicate with them.
And so I'm thinking about the person that says, I always have to, be the bigger person, or I always have to subjugate my feelings to make you feel better. What about those situations where the person says, I'm the one that's always trying, I'm the one that's always, tiptoeing around your feelings, but I don't get that, reciprocity from you?
I'll say one thing, which is that most people in most relationships feel that way. And as I'm saying that, most people are going to say, no, but for me, it's really true. And it's this piece of, we are much more familiar with our own experience, and our own experience is harder, and we don't recognize what's hard for other people. So that's point one. Point two is that this can be something that you have a conversation about, but you want to sort of speak about it very subjectively, recognizing that most people feel some element of that, which is, I often feel like there are important things that I want to communicate with you, but I have to be so careful about how I communicate it that I don't end up being able to share what it is that feels really important to share. And so if I take a step back and sort of say, like, what the skill there is talking about the thing that I want to talk about and why it's hard to talk about it, instead of talking about the actual thing, if that makes sense. So talking about what causes me to hold back, which is that I often feel like if I bring something up, your feelings are going to take precedence and you're not going to be able to hear me. And that feels really hard, given that I want to have a close relationship. And so you bring that up, but you say it in a way that really does kind of open the other person up to recognize that you see that that's just your experience, and they may also have a similar experience or a different experience that similarly needs to be heard.
And I suspect there are some people that you may try all of these wonderful things with, and it just may be that you and that person are not going to be able to communicate effectively about certain topics because their view of the world is going to be so different, Professor Slepian, than your view. Like, we go back to how we started with the crisis between Hamas and Israel. Everybody has a narrative. They've told themselves a story about why this crisis exists, this conflict exists, and those stories are so different. What does the research say? Is there a way to break those impasses when you are talking to someone and their narrative is, you ran the red light, and their narrative is, no, you ran the red light?
Politics is one of the top things people don't want to talk about with other people. We've looked at the conversation topics people least want to discuss with others, and it's things like politics and money and religion and relationships and sex. All the things that are just really hard to talk about. And so, maybe there's a time and place for some of those conversations, and it's more appropriate in certain times than others. Or the ones where you feel like there's some work to be done, or maybe something good could come out of the conversation, maybe those are the ones to try to bring to the table, and do so carefully. If it's really something you've been carrying for a really long time, that to me means like it's something that's really important. And if so, maybe you want to workshop with someone how you're going to talk about this. You don't have to figure out it alone. That's why secrets so often hurt us, is because we're doing them alone. Bringing someone else into the problem to help you work through it before you get to that point of sort of the confrontation could be really helpful.
No, that's great advice. And just any final thoughts, Dr. Schonbrun? Again, this is a difficult time of year for a lot of people. A lot of people are extra stressed out. Any, last minute thing you want us to remember as we try to navigate some of these important relationships in our lives?
Well, one thing just to finish on, because you brought up the conflict in the Middle East, is that we tend to get very black and white in our thinking, very all or nothing, good or bad. And there is often so much more nuance, especially when it comes to relationships, that all people, have some redeemable qualities, and all people make mistakes and accidentally or sometimes even intentionally injure others. And that we need to try to hold on to our ability to see nuance and complexity, even when we're extremely tempted to drop into these narratives that are very extreme and very rigid.
Great advice. This has been an amazing conversation. So much brilliance and so many insights that have been shared. I know they're going to help our viewers and listeners tremendously. Thank you so much, Dr. Schonbrun, and thank you so much, Dr. Slepian, for spending some time with me today. The next voice that you hear will be Robin Ayers in the Raw Report right here on KBLA Talk 1580. Wow,
We've got a lot to talk about. I'm Reverend Gerald, the life coach. Is someone you love struggling with addiction and mental illness? Is improving your family's health important? Want to leave a legacy that your family can grow? Are you ready to enhance your perception of life experiences? Then wake up weekends at 7 a.m. with